Hello, I'm Graham Salinger, founder of Salinger Coaching Solutions, and this is PEP, which is Passion, Empowerment, and Perseverance, where I talk to my guests about what has empowered their success. In other words, what's put a pep in their step and how they have empowered other people. In other words, how they have put a pep in other people's step. I am joined today by Dr. Douglass Teschner. Doug is a proven, results-oriented leader, mentor, trainer, and coach who embraces challenge, integrated vision, and passion for excellence, and inspires a high level of professional performance. He has a depth of U.S. and international experience in the nonprofit sector, business, and state and federal government. And he has a passion for developing leaders and building effective teams and organizations. At the domestic level, Doug spent 12 years, 6 terms, as an elected New Hampshire state legislator and 2 years as the New Hampshire Assistant Secretary of State, where he supported elections and designed and managed a statewide grant program for city and town clerks. Internationally, Mr. Teschner has served as a forestry Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco in the 1970s and rejoined Peace Corps in 2008 for 9 years as a country director and expert consultant, working with more than 1,500 Peace Corps volunteers, my wife and I being among them, and 230 staff in Ukraine. He's also worked in 5 African nations. Drawing on his experience in leadership roles in the United States and around the world, Dr. Teschner founded Growing Leadership LLC in 2017. Growing Leadership supports nonprofits, governments, and businesses by partnering to strengthen their capacity to achieve their highest level of performance, not unsimilar to what Salinger Coaching Solutions also strives to do. Doug also authors the Growing Leadership column and the New Hampshire Business Review. Quite the biography, Doug. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, you get old, when you get old enough, it starts to add up after a while. I just had my 71st birthday, so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no kidding.
But I know, having known you over the years, that you're young at heart, and you just described to me your background involves quite a hike. So as an icebreaker, can you tell our viewers about what's going on in your background?
Well, sure. I mean, hiking has been a big part, and mountaineering too, a big part of my life. And I climbed quite a few mountains in my life in Europe and Africa and North America. And but I live in New Hampshire in the White Mountains, on the edge of the White Mountains between New Hampshire and Vermont. And that mountain behind me is Mount Moosilauke. It's the 10th highest mountain in New Hampshire, 4,802 feet. And you can see it. Well, I can't quite see it from my house because I'm in a little bit of a valley, but very nearby you can see it. It's only about 10 miles away, and we've had a tradition. I've been part of a group since 1988 that climbs that mountain every New Year's Day, and sometimes the weather can be pretty extreme. And this year it was very mild, and that's a picture I took on New Year's Day. And I guess on top of that, I made a very token effort last year because I had knee replacements. I got new knees. My knees kind of wore out from all those years of hiking and other things. And so it was kind of I guess at this stage of my life, it's always a pretty exciting thing when I'm able to get up there and do it. And hey, we had a beautiful day, so I'm grateful for that. So that's the background.
Great, and that serves as a great metaphor for striving to achieve and working through your goals and working through challenges and persistence. So I love it already. Yeah, so apart from your passion for mountain climbing, one of the things that I focus on in Salinger Coaching Solutions is empowering people's passion, their purpose, and perseverance, sort of the 3 Ps or the angles that I work with my clients. So I wanted to start off our conversation, having gone over that bio and the life of the work that you've done. It strikes me that you have both a passion for service and both leadership and organizational development. So I'm interested in where and how you cultivated that passion and your journey in those fields of interest.
Well, that's a great question. And I love passion, purpose, and perseverance, and how do we intersect, what are our values at the core? What's really important to us? And I think it's a lifelong journey. I try to emphasize in the workshops that I do that change is something that's, we always have to be open to change. And not open to change, but embracing change. Mm-hmm. We're looking for positive change. And there's a wonderful cartoon I've seen where a guy looks out at a group and he says, who wants change? And everyone raises their hand. And then he says, who wants to change? And everybody kind of looks down. So I like the idea of, you know, as you go through life, you know, you're looking, you're looking, your life changes, and you know, there's always going to be times maybe we have doubts, or and certainly I have. Um, but what's my passion for service and leadership? You know, I have to say, you know, I mean, I guess my first big um, service was becoming a Peace Corps volunteer after
Mhm.
college. And I have to confess, I'm not sure that I had a pure altruistic motivation. I think I wanted to travel and I wanted to see the world. I was more interested in that than I was necessarily in service, to be honest. But I think through an experience like that, and I am a big fan of the Peace Corps, as you know,
Yeah.
it's because you did serve with me in Ukraine
Mhm.
in some very interesting time in Ukraine when unfortunately that was the biggest. I mean, let me just back up and say, you know, I was many years ago a volunteer back in the 70s when I was in Morocco.
Mhm.
But I had the great pleasure to come back to Peace Corps in 2008 as a country director, which I consider to be really the culmination of really a lifelong work in the terms of leadership, and the chance that it was really my favorite job that I've ever had, and really I consider it the culmination of my career. Not to say that I'm not doing some things now that I think are important, but you know, and you were there in Ukraine in 2014 when you know, the Russians invaded Crimea. We had volunteers down there. We had volunteers over in eastern Ukraine. And so we evacuated all the volunteers home, including you. So you didn't get a chance
Mhm.
to finish your service, although you had a pretty good chunk of time there, fortunately. But
Yes, I was there for 19 months out of the 27, and I was one of the ones that was on the eastern. I was in the Lugansk Oblast, of the eastern Russian
oh,
border. Yeah.
okay. I should have looked that up because I saw the town because I had it written
Yeah.
down. But so you were there, and you're in the area that's been it's now it's still that's still the area that's controlled by the separatists, or on the
Mhm.
borderland.
Well, it was a small enough town that I think it's still operating as was, but
Yeah. Because there's some pretty interesting. One of our volunteers, Chris Miller. I don't know if you knew Chris Miller, but
Mhm.
he went on and worked for the Kyiv Post, and then he's
Yeah.
worked for other media outlets. And there's a pretty amazing story of him traveling back to his community on the Russian side,
Mm.
this goes back a few years, and the interactions he had with folks there. I mean, it's a pretty traumatic experience, obviously, for the people in those communities, but also for our Peace Corps volunteers who are so dedicated and so committed to their communities like you, and to have to say, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go home. I mean, it's a safety consideration.
Mhm.
And then right after that, I moved back. I had been previously in West Africa, in Burkina Faso, before I'd come to Ukraine as country director. And I was convinced to go back to Africa, which I kind of felt bad about leaving the Ukraine staff, because, you know, there was a lot of stress on them, you know, mostly local folks from that country who were wondering whether they're going to have a job. And fortunately, Peace Corps did go back to Ukraine. But I transferred down back to West Africa in the country of Guinea. And 17 days after I arrived, the decision was made that because the Ebola epidemic was getting bad enough, we had to evacuate all the volunteers out of there. So I was kind of the bad luck country director for a while. But when you go through the experience with people of saying, you know, people are sort of committed to what they're doing, and passionate. And I always loved our Peace Corps volunteers, and I'd make a plug to anyone who's interested. And it's not just a young person's game. I mean, I had an 81-year-old Peace Corps volunteer. So some people, maybe later when they retire, they think about doing it. But you know, life can throw you curveball sometimes, and you have to figure out how you're gonna respond to that. And you know, that was a great test for me. You know, what happened in Guinea that was really quite interesting was as the Ebola epidemic grew, the CDC, our own Centers for Disease Control, they didn't have a presence in that part in Guinea,
Mm.
in the country, and they wanted to come in, and you know, and it became, you know, really important to stop the epidemic as our commitment to the world, but also we don't, this was something that could end up in the US, and there were a handful of cases.
Mhm.
So they came in, but they had no grounding in the country, no experience in the country. And so they turned to Peace Corps and our staff, and we provided vehicles and we provided staff. And then, something that was really exciting for us, there was a couple of former Peace Corps volunteers, returned Peace Corps volunteers, we call them, who had served in different countries. And they said, why aren't we using Peace Corps for community education? And we turned to our staff, and we mobilized through all our contacts throughout the country. We educated people about the disease so they could educate people in their communities. And that had a big effect. We think we reached about 3 million people that way, or a quarter of the country. One sort of small one-on-one conversation. So, life throws you some curveballs sometimes. But back to sort of the second part of the question, I guess, is about the leadership. And the importance of leadership, and if you follow, one of the most interesting sources, I think, is the Gallup. The Gallup organization has done polling on workplace attitudes, and they've been doing this over multiple years, so they have some pretty good documentation. And one of their questions is, are you engaged this is to the average worker, are you engaged in your work? And their polling, I think I don't know if I've seen anything since COVID hit, but their polling was about 35% of Americans say they're engaged in their work, which is not very good. And what's the number one factor on whether people feel engaged in their work? And it's the quality of leadership. And so when I left Peace Corps, and it's an interesting thing, I'd probably still be doing it, but Peace Corps is probably the only federal agency where they kick you out, not because you get old, but because they want to just keep new blood coming in.
Right.
And I loved that job. But my time was up, and I thought, well, I don't really want to retire in a fully retire. And so I started my own business, Growing Leadership LLC, and I do trainings and workshops and coaching, some of the kinds of things that you're doing. And people, sometimes it amazes me that we've been so successful as a country, given a lot of these leadership deficits, and the biggest problem I see is, people get too caught up in their own needs, in their own egos, and whether it's trying to please themselves or please the people that be seen as someone who's pleasing people rather than really doing the leadership role, or feeling a need for control, which can bring on sort of micromanagement and other kinds of behaviors that really demoralize people in the workplace. So.
Sorry, I was going to ask, how did you deal with that when you were an elected official in New Hampshire? Because I'm sure that kind of political dynamic came out.
Well, of course, political leadership is a lot different than maybe business leadership, because it's so much more public.
Right.
I had an opportunity. New Hampshire is a very sort of we have town meeting, and it's democracy here is very kind of grassroots. Plus, we're a small state. There's only 1.2 million people, so. But our Constitution, we have a very large legislature. We have a 400-member House. That means you only represent about 3,000 people, and half of them. So suddenly, when I was younger, an opportunity came up, and I thought, well, I could do that, and I ran. And it didn't require a lot of money. In this state, it didn't require a lot of. It was kind of door to door and getting to know people in your community, not like we think of it maybe as a congressional race or anything like that. And that's still true to some degree. But I mean, boy, that was a wonderful opportunity. But as an elected official, you're not just representing your own views. You have to represent the people that sent you there. So it's very easy to sit here and say, well, my opinion on this issue is X. But when you start getting a lot of calls from people saying, well, my opinion is Y, well, how do you pull that together? I mean, It's a challenging thing. But I mean, the part that I really enjoyed the most, people think of legislators as people who are sitting in big halls having debates, like the Capitol, of course, which we've seen, has been so much in the news these last few days. And the part of the work that I really enjoyed was much more intimate, much more. It was with constituents. People would call you up with a problem. I had people sit in my in my living room and tell me that the state agency had taken away their child unfairly, and that they weren't involved in abusive behavior. Or I got involved with another family that had issues with foster care, that they'd been foster parents, and you suddenly have a very intimate view into people's lives. I mean, that part of the job for me was really, really powerful. And I also enjoyed working on state projects. So, not too far away from where I live here, I could take you to a state park where there's a beach, and when I go down there swimming and people are enjoying themselves. And that was part of my project, to bring that state park to the town. Or there's another place where there's a boat launch on the Connecticut River up here that I was very instrumental in. And so those kind of projects give me a lot of satisfaction. So, but I don't know about today, who would want to run for politics? People ask me, I've been out for a long time. I mean, I've been out. 2002 was the last time I was in office.
Okay.
And, in today's environment, it's a lot different.
Sure. Yeah. You alluded to, Doug, you alluded to some curveballs that you've experienced in your career. What happened in Ukraine, the ongoing conflict that started while we were there. You were in Guinea, as you said, only 17 days into your service there as leader. There was the Ebola outbreak. And as you just alluded to, our current political climate in the United States, we're dealing with political conflict, and we're dealing, as everybody else is, with the pandemic of COVID. So I'm coming to you, this interview is happening at a time where curveballs have become just part of our reality and having to deal with our reality. So those perspectives, you've alluded to them a little bit so far. So just to follow up on the discussion we started, how have your experiences as a leader dealing with political conflict and the fallout of political conflict and the fallout of a pandemic, how have those experiences helped you think about and respond to organizational change and crisis in the work that you currently do and with your business?
Well, any business, I'm sort of semi-retired, and my business, I'm in sort of a lucky position where I'm not totally dependent on the income from my business, which is in one way, it's very nice. In another way, if you are more dependent, maybe you're a little more hungry or a little more passionate. But, it's amazing what we've been able to do. I'm working with a group called Braver Angels. It's trying to sort of bring people together across the political divide. As a volunteer, I'm doing that. We can talk about that a little later. But I mean, I've worked with a group on Zoom, and most of whom I've never met in person. There's a couple of them I met like once. And I've been really surprised by sort of the intimacy of those conversations and how we've been able to develop relationships, which is pretty amazing. And think about it, I'm dealing with folks now from all over northern New England. In this one group I'm really active with Braver Angels, and we probably, a lot of people wouldn't be in those meetings because we'd have to drive so many hours to get together. And, now we can just kind of click on it and we're there. And so one of the things I think is going to be interesting when the COVID recedes, which hopefully it will soon, what's the new normal going to look like? We're not going back. I think this is a key now is sort of, it's amazing how we've been able to connect with people, even though, it's not the same, it's different. And yet, but it also has advantages. We're not having to travel. And when we talk about people, I hear people say we want to go back to normal, but we're not going back to normal. We're going to a new normal. It's going to be a new normal. And I think anyone in business or even in life, what I talked about before about change,
Right.
we all need to be open to change. And yeah, that's hard sometimes because, we're all creatures of habit, but the world is going to look a little different. It's going to affect every business, and my business, because I'm kind of semi-retired and not quite as dependent on it. I've tried to be more cautious, and I mean, I do think it's hard maybe to do the kind of work we do without face-to-face meetings, at least initially.
Right.
But, I was talking to a business the other day that I'm probably going to be doing some work for. And, the business owner said to me, they're interested in a leadership transition and working with them. This is very forthright kind of planning by this business leader, a small business with 12 employees.
Mm.
that he's been involved with for 30 years. And he said, I'm thinking about retiring in a few years, and I want to think about how we're going to transition this business and what's the future going to look like. And he talked about, and he had seen one of my columns in the New Hampshire Business Review where I write about different issues. The last one was about values, living with your values in the workplace, and how do you embrace your values in the workplace. And excuse me, I quoted the last line of a wonderful poem by Mary Oliver, which is A Summer Day. And the last line is, what is it you, and she's talking about a grasshopper, but all of a sudden, and she's analyzing this grasshopper, and all of a sudden she breaks out with this famous last line that says, and what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And I mean, that line has resonated for me, and I guess it resonated for the business owner who saw that in my column, and he said, yeah, my one wild and precious life, and I'm thinking about retirement, and I want to think about a transition. And but the interesting part about it was he talked about managing his business remotely. It's a kind of course, a lot of people don't have the option of managing their business remotely. They're, and I think people, it's hard for people to be working from home and all that, but God bless it if you have a job where you can work from home and they're still willing to pay you. I mean, think of the people. I worry so much about the people that have jobs where, the service industries and these folks. But in this particular business, he's able to do it. And he described the meetings they're having. But, it's not the same when, we hear businesses saying, well, we're going to go completely remote after this. Yeah, we don't need to pay for all the office and all that kind of thing. But so I think this is going to be one of the struggles that I think people are going to have to figure out. But this guy was saying, well, I don't know if we can talk about transition, how I'm going to bring you in and it's all going to be on Zoom. How are they even going to get to know you? And so we're probably going to do some workshops as a way. You got to build trust. You got to build relationships. Everything is built on relationships.
Right.
And how do you develop a relationship with people? And it's harder to do using technology than it is face to face when you can look somebody in the eye in a more personal way. But I think that's going to be one of the challenges going forward. And he's struggling with his own business now that everyone's working remotely. And he described how many meetings they're having and whatnot. But I'm guessing, a future is going to be that people are going to be in the office 2 days a week and remotely 3 days a week or something like that. Because I don't think you can ever give up that personal connection. I think when you have a relationship with somebody, it's a lot easier to maybe work remotely. So I think these are some of the challenges that that my business and every business is going to be facing.
Yeah. And so based on your experience dealing with pandemic or just perilous times in general, is there other important lessons you would want business leaders or managers to think about in terms of how to deal with our current realities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In fact, I wrote about that in one of my columns, and I took as an example Alex Lascaris, who was our ambassador. You didn't know him. This was in Guinea, not in Ukraine. But we are in this country. Ebola was present there before I got there. I remember saying to the folks in Washington, well, what's going on with Ebola? You want me to go down there? He said, well, it's under control. It's under control. And I arrived down there, and I think about 2 weeks after I got there, there was there was 2 missionaries in Liberia, which is the next country over, that had gotten Ebola. And I said to my Peace Corps medical officer, I said, this is bad. And he says, oh no, for us. He said, why? And I said, well, I'll tell you. He says, they're medical workers. Our volunteers aren't doing that. And I said, yeah, but I'll tell you, a lot of it comes down to media perception. And I had seen this in Ukraine with how our folks in Washington were viewing our situation in Ukraine, which we thought most of the country was really quite safe. Obviously not that area where you were, or we weren't going to send volunteers to Crimea, the areas that the Russians had controlled, but like Western Ukraine was quite safe. But so much of it is driven by what somebody called media optics. And suddenly, when 2 missionaries from Liberia got Ebola, the story erupted across the U.S. And then all of a sudden, I think it was 3 days later, we got the call, we're going to evacuate the volunteers, kind of even more stronger than I predicted.
Sure.
So, these external events have a way of sort of controlling us. It's like riding a wave. You get hit by a wave, and how do you surf the wave as opposed to getting smacked in the face by the wave? I think that's the question when you try to deal with change and manage change.
Okay, great. And speaking of managing change, I do want to talk to you a little bit more about getting in the weeds about Growing Leadership LLC. I know that it broadly works to help build positive work climates, develop leadership skills, build effective teams, and deal with uncertain times, as we've just talked about at length. Similarly, at Salinger Coaching Solutions, I draw on my expertise in conflict resolution and as a mediator and restorative justice practitioner to help leaders so that they can create resilient and agile teams. Can you walk my viewers through the process that you go through with your clients and some success stories?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think, like I said at the beginning, everything comes down to relationships and in relationships and sort of a willingness to be open, a willingness to be open. When I mentioned this client I just had a conversation with, or potential client, and what I loved about that conversation was how he was saying he wasn't predicting what the outcome was going to be. He wasn't predicting what people were going to say. He wanted to listen to what people had to say. And what I took away from that was a lot of authenticity. Authenticity is so important. You mentioned your P's of passion, purpose, and perseverance, and I love that. And, I have a long list of sort of leadership qualities. And the most important leadership qualities are ones that come down to, personal characteristics of who the person is and what they're about.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about doing leadership training, it's not that easy to sort of paste it on people. It sort of comes, so much of it comes from within. Mm-hmm. Of this long list of characteristics, 3 that really are important to me are: one is authenticity. Another, I think, is positive energy. I don't mean necessarily being, a mega cheerleader, but being, sort of optimistic about where the possibilities are, looking for where there's lemonade in the lemons. And I also think self-awareness. I think you have to be really sort of self-critical of yourself, and both in terms of your own, how I react to certain situations, or how as well as how my behavior is going to be perceived by others. I'll tell you a story that you'll find interesting. That relates to your own experience when I was the country director in Ukraine. And you'll remember that it was a long time. These demonstrations had been going on for months before we evacuated volunteers. I think they started in November, and I don't think we evacuated until February. And you might remember I was sending out updates, what was going on. I was trying to be transparency. I think is really important. Mm-hmm. But one of the things we were trying to do, because most of the activity at the beginning was all in Kyiv, and we were the capital, and we were trying to keep people out. And so I was managing with my staff about, with only certain reasons we're going to have volunteers come to the city. And I can remember, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, one of the staff gave me a report of how many people were going to be there that weekend. And it was a long list. And I was just, why? And I got really angry. Why? And I sort of mouthed off and got really out of control. And afterwards, of course, you reflect on that. And I said, oh, well, that was bad behavior. But I also think people know me enough so they know that that's not really who I am. So I don't think I need to say anything about it. Well, the next week, staff came up to me and said, Doug, people were really upset about the way you behaved, and you need to say something. And I so appreciated that, because I think a big part of being a leader is you got to be open to feedback, really open to feedback. I'm very big on people having individual. I really encourage anybody who's in a managerial role to have regular meetings with your staff, and where you ask them, and I don't just mean day-to-day interactions. I'm talking about like I did once a month, or it could be every 2 weeks. Ken Blanchard says every 2 weeks. I think I'm happy with once a month. And one of my questions is always, do you have any feedback for me? And people are hesitant to, are hesitant to maybe to say things to the boss. But when you ask it enough, they will give you feedback. And it's so important to be open to that kind of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they gave me that feedback about my bad behavior with the Peace Corps Ukraine staff, of course I had to go out and say something and apologize, and which is how I was feeling anyway, but I had to be more sort of public about it. And so your question is, when you're working with when you're going to work with groups, I mean, of course, so much is important is what's the climate in the leadership at the top.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you hope that it's coming from the top, because it's not that easy to work with groups if you don't have really support from the top.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if the CEO says, I want you to develop some of my leaders, but maybe she doesn't want to be part of the group, and it's not to say you can't do things, because you can always do things with people,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't create the kind of total climate that you're hoping for.
Sure. One of the things that I appreciate that you mentioned, and you brought up values earlier, right? When you keep coming back to this idea of relationships, and when you manage teams or you manage people, right? You're fundamentally managing relationships, and so you're managing people's expectations, right? Sometimes there's goal misalignment because of expectations, or you're managing commitment versus compliance, just doing it because the boss said so versus being committed to it. Sort of as you alluded to the Gallup poll, where a lot of people are doing their work but not doing it passionately. And so, yeah, I think a lot of management, in terms of managing staff, you're managing like priorities too, right? So that's a really interesting example you gave about, I gave the directive that no one comes, and then there's a long list of people. There's some misalignment, not necessarily miscommunication between maybe my goals and other people's goals. So that's interesting.
Managing expectations is so important. Managing your own, you got to start with managing your own expectations. It starts with you as the leader. You got to manage yourself. And then you've got to be clear about what you want. And so, when you have poor communication, a lot of it comes down to managing expectations. To people that is everybody operating off the same page? And this is a common area that things break down in a business or an organization.
Are there other common challenges that like your specific clients bring to you? Is there a commonality between the leaders that come to you asking for your work, or is it kind of a range of different topics that you work through?
Well, it's interesting when you work with people. I do workshops, and let's say I'm working with a business, and I'm doing a workshop and about leadership skills, team building, and any other. And I'm bringing meaning to the workplace. I think that's such an important topic we could talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And but what you find, say in a typical group, you might have people kind of in three categories. You have people who are sort of open for change, or they're hungry, and what you're offering them is just what they're ready for. I mean, those are the people you love. I mean, that they're ready for whatever you have. And of course, a lot of it has to do with their own self-awareness about their own situation, or their own willingness to really look at change, or reflect, or that self-awareness that we talked about earlier. Then you have other people who are maybe not quite there, but are taking it in. And then there's always, I think, a group of people who you're kind of talking past them, And in a group, it's challenging, because you're trying to connect with people at their level as much as you can. But if you're doing a workshop for a group of people, if you're doing individual coaching, well, that's, I won't say easier, but it's you're just focusing on that person and where they're coming from, and you're asking questions. You ask a lot of questions to try to understand where they're coming from, and it's more about asking questions than it is giving answers a lot of the time. And but when you're dealing with a group, you have different people that are on certain levels, and as someone, you want to try to connect with people at the level they're at. But when they connect with you, boy, that is the most exciting thing. I mean, I I just got a card the other day from someone. I just thought I'd share it with you.
Sure.
I read this to somebody the other day. I had a hard time crying, but it says, as the year comes to a close, I'm always reminded of the people who have come into my life and impacted me in ways I'll always be grateful for and never forget. You, Doug, are that individual. I cherish your friendship, mentorship, genuine joy and love you continue to give me. I mean, in this kind of business, when you get feedback like that, you got to go, wow. I mean, that's what you're hoping for, because at the end of the day, this is all about people. And, you're trying to grow yourself and trying to help other people grow. And when you interact with people and maybe they don't get that much out of it, then you think, well, maybe I can do better. Maybe I have to do better. But you always connect with some people, and it has a powerful, it can be powerful and empowering and really exciting and gratifying. And, you go to bed sleeping well that night. And then the next day you have a setback. It doesn't work. And, this is life as you go through it. But I think, we're all striving for happiness in life, and what is happiness? What does that mean?
Sure.
What does happiness mean? And I've kind of come to the conclusion that probably the number one factor in happiness is whether you embrace gratitude for what you have. We're all so quick to look at what we don't have. And, and to some degree, our economic model is sort of set up that way, keeping up with the Joneses or trying to keep up with what other people have or what other people need. But when you stop and you think about expressing gratitude for what you have, I think that's probably the most critical factor to have happiness and to be, fully centered and fully satisfied in life. Not to say you're not striving. We're all striving to do better and do more. But take time to smell the roses, it's so important.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think I really appreciate your comment on empowering people, and it's a people-centered business, the work that we do. And in fact, you can't actually see it in my background, but Salinger Coaching Solutions, our slogan is empowering success, empowering people, because and that's not just I didn't just come up with that. Like, that's sort of it's a way of being in the profession that you and I share. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, my next question is actually about empowerment. As I've alluded to, I empower people's passions, purpose, and perseverance. So I'm wondering, in your own career, what does empowerment look like to you, both in terms of what has empowered you to be successful in your various roles and hats, and how have you empowered other people in those roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was listening to, I don't know if you're familiar with Brene Brown, but Brene Brown is a very popular podcast, or if you go back to her, you can go back to her TED Talk about, she's someone who was a professor in Texas and did a TED Talk about the relationship between courage and vulnerability. And you can't have courage without vulnerability, which kind of goes against sort of how some people see leadership. The leaders are always strong, and et cetera. And I was reflecting on that, thinking about how do we approach our life in a sort of a meaningful way that brings that kind of courage and vulnerability into it. And Brene is another one who talks about values and living your values, and what are your top values. And I wrote about this in my last column. I quoted Brene about, try to focus on what are the values that really drive you the most. And I guess I diverted from your question a little bit. I got off talking about Brene. I had another point about Brene that I was going to go somewhere with Brene, and I'm sorry I lost it.
Yeah, the question was just about, in your own experience, how have you been empowered and how have you empowered others?
Yeah, to be empowered is so much of it goes back to, I was going to talk about, Brene did an interview with Jim Collins, who had a very famous leadership book, From Good to Great.
It's a great,
yeah. And she interviewed him, and he talked about your personal hedgehog, which I thought was really interesting. And he talked about the intersection between, and I encourage people to look at that podcast. It's a 2-hour podcast. Brene's sometimes Renee talks a lot. You know, you have to go through there a little bit to find the strong stuff. But I thought that time when she talked about your personal hedgehog, he said, you know, the fox is clever and can do all kinds of things, but a hedgehog can kind of curl up and keep him from being eaten. And it's a more specialized kind of an animal. And he said, you know, it's an intersection of passion, economic benefit, and what's your capacity? What can you be great at?
Right.
You know, so it's not just passion. It's not just what you're passionate about. I mean, I might be passionate about sports, but I'm not that good an athlete. You know, what is it? You know, we all have different aptitudes. So how do you merge your passion and your aptitudes with something that could be economically beneficial?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he said in that interview that hopefully by maybe age 30, you've found that. And I look back on my life, and, you know, I've got a lot of different career changes, and I don't know if I found anything. I don't know if I was clear about some of this till maybe I was 50. But I mean, life is a journey, you know, life is a journey. There's a great quote from, I think, you know, I use a lot of quotes you might remember.
I remember.
From one of the, I think one of the Buddhists said, the journey is the reward. The journey is the reward. And as someone who's done a lot of climbing mountains, it's not about, you know, I'm all for getting to the top of the mountain. Don't get me wrong. I love getting to the top of the mountain, but that isn't really what it's about. It's about the climb.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the climb. And so as you're going through life, you know, we're never going to get to that moment of you know, nirvana, the ultimate. But along the way, we can have a lot of moments, of great moments, as we're finding ourselves and moving forward and empowering. You know, it's sort of self-empowerment and helping
Mm-hmm.
people to see that that's sort of the path that they want to go on. And as a coach, you can help people to sort of frame their lives in ways that they can see that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's a lot of the work that I do as well is, you know, the perseverance journey, right? Obviously, the mountain climbing obviously requires physical perseverance. That's why it's a beautiful metaphor. But also the idea of purpose, right? So even if you have to move things, right? So even if you have goals and something happens, like you get evacuated, right? Or something happens, like there's a sickness, these curveballs, if we still have that purpose, then that can still help us find the other thing that drives us, even if that specific activity or specific job or specific thing falls apart. If you have that underlying passion, sense of perseverance, and the overall purpose, which is sort of the you know, what you want to get out of life, and probably what probably drove both of us to Peace Corps originally, right? That's where that ties in. Yeah, go ahead.
When you said that, I thought about repurposing your purpose.
Okay. Well, and that's important too.
You know, how do we, you know, maintain purpose, but bring it into in a little bit different angle, you know?
Sure. Speaking of something that has a specific purpose, you alluded to Braver Angels, and so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. I know that you were recently promoted to the regional leader for New England. For my viewers' contexts, Braver Angels seeks to help depolarize American society through dialogue. Dialogue is a passion of mine, and it really focuses on empowering people to do better at listening, to seek to understand and communicate with people that have political views that are different from their own. I would argue that all of those things, listening, trying to seek better understanding and better communication when you have challenges, are also skills that any workplace could use some work with as well. So that's kind of the connection that I have in terms of developing.
Well, yeah, one of my favorite books is Stephen Covey, you know, the 7 Habits of Successful People,
Mm-hmm.
which is, that's not what, but you know, and you know, it's funny, I was familiar with it, but I never read it until a couple of years ago. When I went back and read it, I went, wow, there's so much in this book that's so powerful. But one of his 7 habits is seek to understand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, somehow, you know, in our country, we've lost the ability to listen to other people.
Mm-hmm.
we listen to respond. We don't listen
To understand.
to understand.
Right.
You got to listen to understand. And this is sort of playing out in a lot of negative ways, in particular in our politics right now.
Sure.
And, we've just seen these terrible events the other day. But the fact is, we had 80 million people vote for one guy for president, and 74 million voted for a different guy, with two very, very, very different visions. And I'm I'm not going to, for 1 second, defend people who broke into the Capitol, but there weren't 74 million people who voted in the Capitol. It was only, I don't know, so many thousand. I mean, I think it's really incumbent on all of us to try to listen and respect each other, because I don't agree with your politics doesn't mean that I think you're evil. I mean, this is sort of where this has gotten to.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, our outgoing president is sort of, he's sort of been a poster child for this, unfortunately. So it makes it a little bit harder to sort of frame this discussion. But
Sure.
we really need to listen to people and understand people and see where people are coming from,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just put ourselves in a bubble. People are in a social media bubble where they're just listening to other people who agree with them. People are looking now. I came off just before this interview. I was on a discussion with Braver Angels folks, a workshop about how to improve the media. And I've been saying, the biggest problem with the media is that people want biased media. They want media that reinforces what they already think.
Sure.
And this is sort of the problem we've gotten into now. Well, if I'm a liberal, I only listen to liberal news stations, or if I'm a conservative, I only listen to conservative news stations or newspapers or media feeds. And this country was built. Disagreement politically is on policy, of course. That's what the marketplace of ideas is all about. But don't call me evil just because I disagree with you, or malicious, or whatever.
Right. The idea that you can disagree without being disagreeable.
Exactly.
Is true for work. It's true for marriage. It's true for friendship. It's true for our politics.
And basic kindness toward each other. What's happened to that? What happened to Mr. Rogers? I mean,
Sure.
how do we treat each other?
Sure.
Is really a concern. So anyway, Braver Angels was founded after the last election. There's a whole array of workshops. I encourage people to look at it, braverangels.org. It used to be called Better Angels, so it might be a little confusion there, but Braver Angels. And it's very volunteer driven. I am regional leader for New England. That's a volunteer position. I don't get paid. And I also have Alliance. We have what they call Alliance, where we meet regularly with people. I mentioned this earlier, how close we've gotten to each other on Zoom. And, people are looking for safe spaces where they can go and have a conversation and be listened to without being judged all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, I'm seeing that. And I think people are hungry people are dismayed by this politics. And it's, obviously played out to the max just this week.
Sure.
With these terrible events in Washington.
Right.
So I'd encourage people to go to braverangels.org. There's a bunch of workshops you can go up, sign up for free. There's one on families and politics, how to talk to family members. We have this situation where people go to Thanksgiving dinner and you either have sort of a confrontation with your relative who doesn't agree with you, mm-hmm. or it's sort of like there's this elephant in the room, or I call it the elephant or the donkey in the room, where people just avoid conversation. But what we really need is to be able to have conversations that are respectful. And it just teaches people how to have respectful conversations. So I'd encourage people to go to that website, look at it. You can become a member for $12 a year, but you don't have to be a member to sign up for some of the workshops, book discussions, and other things. Mm-hmm. So, I've just been concerned about how our country's going, and that's what kind of brought my passion to that, as well as my sense of where I thought I could offer something.
Sure. And how has that experience been for you, sort of personally, having lived in Ukraine, where the political divide's different, but we saw it erupting in protest that led to violence, that led to war. And you were also an you've also been elected official and worked in politics. So how has this work in Braver Angels been for you personally to see constructive conversations happening around politics?
Well, I can remember fistfights in the Ukraine parliament, and we thought, well, we're glad that never happens in the US. I mean, we haven't actually had a fistfight, but we had an invasion.
Right.
Um, but the other thing I think about is my time in Africa. I did some democracy work through the U.S. Agency for International Development. I did work in Rwanda and Morocco, working with the parliaments there. And, one of the things you see is in sub-Saharan Africa a lot is there's a lot of tribal influence in the politics. So people from this tribe only vote for certain candidates. And I can remember thinking, well, I'm glad we don't have that in the US. But now we've sort of manufactured tribes, or there is this people are in tribes right now. There's a really interesting report, The Hidden Tribes of America. And someone talks about the but there is an exhausted majority. People from the two ends are sort of driving the discussion, but there's a lot of people in the middle who are looking for something else and looking for a better discussion. And so, but yes, I mean, you think about these things, and I worry that our country has always been looked up to for our democracy. Yes, we're imperfect. Yes, we've had problems, but and hopefully we have imperfections, so we can go forward and build on our problems and create a better future. But if we just going to pull apart and not listen to people who disagree with us, I don't know where that goes. So I'm concerned about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so there's we've talked about a lot of themes. We've talked about international work, domestic work. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about crises and curveballs. And one of the important things you talked about is dialogue and communication, especially in the context of challenging times. So given all that we've already discussed in terms of communication in challenging times, what would you say are the biggest obstacles to people effectively communicating and having critical conversations in work settings? And what should leaders and team members do to create and foster workspaces where difficult conversations can take place?
Well, I think a lot of it comes, people need skills in communicating. I mean, I don't know how, didn't we used to teach people this stuff in kindergarten? I don't know. Listen to what somebody else wants, share in the sandbox. I think we somehow lost that, we've lost people's ability to just, I think basic listening skills are critical, for all levels, not just politics, how to listen. And, I'll admit, it's not always my strongest suit. I mean, I'm trying to keep working and improving, but how to be a good listener and how to be a little more, be more open. I think we all need to be open. We're closed. I don't know. I think a lot of people feel threatened or fearful, or whether it's physical fear or fear about how they understand the world and don't want to see that change. I think we have a lot of work to do. But so what I appreciate about any of this kind of work with coaching and leadership development of the business, this plays out into other aspects of people's lives. We're teaching people skills that are kind of universally valuable. Just like, one of the founders of Braver Angels said to me, well, maybe we should work on a workshop for how do people get people to talk about politics in the workplace. And I said, well, I'd be all in on that. I'm already kind of doing that. This is where these things intersect.
Right.
So I think it goes back to people, to sort of looking at themselves, self-awareness, understanding where maybe, being a little self-critical, not in a overly shameful way or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But I mean, just how can we be better as people? How can we be, if we're going to be better as a country, we have to all be better as people. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to demand more of our political leaders, because they're kind of playing into this. They're kind of reinforcing some of this narrative, unfortunately. But if the people demand it, if the people, we want something better, We want a better union where people are respected, and everyone needs to be respected and treated with dignity. And I mean everyone. And I mean even those people that broke into the Capitol, who I vehemently disagree with. There are people, and you got to step back, and they need to be prosecuted. But you always need to go back and say, well, what is it that makes these people so fearful or so scared or so whatever that they're breaking into the Capitol? I mean, I think that has to be, part of the equation. And even yes, they got to be prosecuted. But there's a lot of people who are feeling left out in this country right now,
Sure.
whether it's Black Lives Matter folks or white rural folks. I mean, that feel like the country's kind of passing them by somehow, and they see an answer in Mr. Trump or some of the things that have been advocated. And people need respect, and they need dignity. And yes, they got to follow the law, and yes, they got to be prosecuted. But I think we all need to be a little more respectful and kind to each other.
Yeah, I think it actually goes back to the comic that you alluded to at the beginning, right? Who wants change? Everybody. Who wants to change? Nobody, right? Because change, if you're the one doing it, that is kind of it can be threatening in a workspace if something happens that you didn't have buy-in in, because maybe the leader didn't create buy-in, and so you're just kind of going along with it, or you're just uncertain what change looks like, or you're used to the status quo. I think change is in political context and in work context can be threatening. I mean, even if it's meant to be.
Work context, one of the great indicators of problem is the meeting after the meeting. People go to a meeting and they have a discussion, and then they walk out and they go in little groups and they start talking about this one said that and this one said yeah.
Right.
But there wasn't an atmosphere where people felt they could share what was on their mind in that meeting. When people have meetings where they feel open to share. One of these Brene Brown says she does her meeting. She had at the beginning of every meeting, they go around and everybody has supposed to say 2 words about how they're feeling right now. I mean, that's pretty. Granted, it's hard to see that in a lot of businesses maybe, but something like that where people, or people should feel that they can they're an open environment to express themselves. And so much of it comes back to leadership, where leadership is really willing to listen to where people are coming from. And understand what their concerns are. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with them, and sometimes people need to be told that's a great idea, but we're not going that way. People need to be heard, and people need dignity, and people need respect, whether it's the workplace, the home, and politics.
Right. Yeah, it all starts with creating that culture sort of feedback loop that you talked about earlier. Great. So Doug, we've covered a lot. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that relates to these topics that you think would be interesting for my viewers to know?
Well, I think it was really, I think you did a great job framing these questions, because we really covered a lot of territory. And, I'm always interested to talk to folks about Brave Angels or leadership, or they can reach out to me. And, I admire what you're doing with your business, and because it's so important. And yet it doesn't get enough attention. I mean, one of the things I've noticed about leadership, it just doesn't get enough attention. People get, when I was on a hike where I was walking with a guy, and he was retired, and he said, yeah, I worked for this big tech company for years, and they put me up in management, but nobody ever told me, what to do or how to be better at it. I wasn't that good. And I reflected on that. And I said, here's a guy being put in management, and he doesn't get the kind of training and support he needs to be effective in that role.
Right.
And what about the people that work for him? He probably wasn't doing them any favors either, because,
right.
And so when people are, this is so common that people are put in management because of good performance or whatever, but, that doesn't mean they're going to be good as a leader. And people really need, training and support, coaching, whether it's from their boss or from outside people like yourself or me, to prepare themselves so that when they take on those jobs, they can be most effective. Because people who aren't fully engaged are not going to be your most productive employees.
Right.
The companies that have done this have been the most successful. But it's surprising sometimes that we're leaving a lot of good work and outcomes on the shop floor because we haven't dealt with, some of these just very basic issues, or where there's conflict. How do you manage conflict in work? Rather than people are so afraid of it, they just ignore it. But
Absolutely.
if employees are going having conflicts with each other that affects their work, it
Right.
needs to be addressed in a constructive, engaged way, and people need the skills to know how to do that stuff. So I think the kind of work you're doing is really important, Graham, and
Thank you.
I wish you the best, and maybe we need to have a chance to work together on a project someday.
Let's do it.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.